Okay, so what I just wanted to touch on today is that when we think about reporting, do people really like it? I mean, a question for you now. Who really loves reporting? I mean, writing all of that information down. Oh, we've got one hand up. I can already see it. The lights are pretty bright. There's another hand. Who is it? Put your hands in the air. Tell me who loves reporting. Oh, all right, okay. Well, kudos to that person who put their hand up at the back, because I can put my hand on my heart and say, it was never really the most favorite part of my assessment. So I've got to say, reporting, though, is really, really, it's a critical part, really. So for that assessment process, because it's providing that evidence. And one of the things is it also provides a baseline. And that baseline, you can then build on it and have those kinds of security improvements.
So most of us at some point in our time will have seen one of those photo mosaics, I think they're called. It's where there's one big picture, but when you look at it more closely, you see there's lots of little photographs inside of that. So that, to me, is kind of how reporting works. It's sort of like a photo mosaic. If we then imagine that that larger photo is your entity's annual compliance, you can imagine those smaller photos in size as data points from the assessment itself. One might be where the CDE looks like, another evidence of people interviewed, and maybe being opportunities for improvement. It's worth noting here that there have been changes to both the ROC and the AOC to promote better alignment between the documents, so that the broader compliance picture is crystal clear, no matter which document you're reading. Little malfunction, won't be a minute. So let's focus on opportunities for a moment here. There's opportunities for improvement. So in earlier sessions, Emma told you about in place with remediation and how that is expected to evolve for reporting in PCI DSS version 4.0. I'm not going to cover that off again, as I'm sure you'll hear more about that as we move on.
So thinking about those kind of opportunities for improvement that you were just mentioning, that sounds a little bit like, what's in ISO audits?
Yeah, that's about right, John, actually. Right. So I know for the ISO conformance audits that the PCI programs undergo. So I value those opportunities for improvement, because from those I can leverage for the resources that our team's going to need to improve on going forwards. That's what we're aiming for here. Capture and assessor findings for where we may want to evolve an approach or exercise better discipline over time to prevent slippage. So, thinking way back when, and by that I mean 20 years ago, a cybersecurity expert, Bruce Schneider, wrote that people often represent the weakest link in the security chain and are chronically responsible for the failure of security systems. Wise words, I think. When you can't use a clicker, that's a failure in that way. Though tech and automation have replaced a lot of the human links in the security chain, of course, humans still exist in most CDEs, so errors still occur. As such, our expectation is that most assessments will see the QSA identify some opportunity for improvement. So some security hygiene issue, whatever that may be, that could develop in time into a much bigger issue further down the track. That's a reasonable expectation and assumption to make, I believe. So at the Council, we request and stipulate that all QSA companies participate in the QSA annual questionnaire process. We do this not just to be bloody-minded, but we do it so that we can monitor everything from adherence to the QSA qualification requirements to reduced content from AOCs, etc., to monitor things like scoping and the use of compensating controls. This will, though, of course, evolve over time, so you may see more supporting documentation that may come out as the result from those changes to version 4 of the PCI DSS. Thinking now of the ROC reporting template, and when you look at it at the first point there, you may think that it's a mountain of reporting requirements. And as I say, that will be at first glance. But what I'd ask you to do here when you look at that and think about it is that while the formatting of tick boxes for assessment findings, and both in the customised and defined validation, they make for a longer report. We acknowledge that. We're not denying that. But the actual reporting verbiage that has been actually reduced as we try to focus on the QSAs providing a narrative at just the requirement and the sub-requirement level and not at each testing procedure. So it should hopefully be easier.
So, if we're thinking about that kind of version 4 and the testing procedures, are they being reported differently?
Yep. So at the testing procedures, the QSA will cite the related paperwork evidence that the QSA has retained. It's the evidence that supports the findings. So you're still showing your work, but you're not actually having to restate it as well.
Okay, so the testing evidence, right, I understand that, so that will be in the work papers. So how's the assessed entity going to be affected by the changes in reporting?
So really that comes down to retention of paperwork, basically. So the QSA qualification requirements, they require that all evidence from an assessment, and this isn't a change, this must already be maintained for a period of 3 years as a minimum, and they have to be made available to PCI staff upon request. So we're aware that in some instances where assessed entities retain this evidence themselves, and since reporting they must show where the evidence collated is stored. So that's ongoing work paper evidence. The retention may only be assessed entities they need to calibrate on. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. So after this presentation, we're going to have a panel discussion on the customised validation. And actually, John, I think you're in that. So plenty more going to be communicated on this topic. What is worthy of note, though, is that most requirements and those sub-requirements have this option. And while the size of all ROCs is impacted by these additional rows, it's a choice for each organisation. It's a choice for them to make whether the impact is any deeper than that. So if you want to, you can absolutely stick with the defined approach and tick no at the end there where it says indicate whether a customised approach was used. It's your prerogative to do that. If you do that, that will be the end of it, done and dusted. However, if you actually implement a customised validation, then there's more to it. So another reporting change that's been brought in that is now optionally available is partial compliance. Partial compliance, or the ability to provide a compliant AOC for an assessment against a subset of those requirements. So think closely here. The intent is not to change what it means to have a compliant AOC, but rather to ensure there is transparency as to what was actually assessed. So there has previously been some confusion, we understand, on how to use not applicable versus not tested. And we'll be working with assessors to clarify understanding of each of those points. The real intent here, though, is for an assessor to be able to produce a compliant AOC in cases where it's most appropriate to mark some requirement as not tested, for example. So that could be an assessment against the prioritised approach, which has been updated for version 4. So now that we've touched on those biggest changes with the ROCs, John, what I'm going to ask you to do, if you don't mind, is can you tell us about the changes made to the SAQs? And I'm going to hand you this little technical piece of equipment.
Well, we'll see if this really does go wrong at this point, or whether it might be user error. But here we go. So just before I start giving a summary of those significant updates for the self-assessments, I just want to give a quick recap for everyone. So self-assessments, or SAQs, there are validation tools for merchants and service providers who are, and wait, this is the really important part, eligible to evaluate and report their PCI DSS compliance via self-assessment. So organizations really need to reach out to the acquirer or applicable payment brand to understand whether they are eligible for those self-assessments. So we've got a snapshot here of some of those self-assessment questionnaires. So just as a really high-level overview here, so the big point here is the requirements now in those self-assessments are matching what's in PCI DSS, so they're no longer phrased as questions. And we've also added completion guidance and applicability notes in there as well. One thing I want to stress here, though, is that in PCI DSS version 4, we've merged and we've split apart many of those requirements. So it's not as straightforward. So the critical piece of advice here is going to be read all of those requirements in the SAQs and don't be swayed by previous SAQs that have been done. So the other point as well here is that the customized validation isn't an option in those SAQs. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on two of those SAQs, and that's SAQA and SAQD for service providers. And the reason for this is we want to focus on SAQA, and the prime thing here is it gives a bit of an example and a bit of an insight into some of the changes that have been made. Now, in contrast, we've got SAQD for service providers, and the reason we've included this just as a bit of a review is it's significantly different, well, not significantly, it is different from all of the other SAQs, and that's primarily because there are additional reporting options. So, SAQA. Now, here we've just got, and this is only a snapshot of some of the changes that are in there. So again, just to stress, read everything that's in there. So, we've added additional SAQs, so from 321, and they are the existing requirements, but they had not been previously included in SAQA. But these are going to be effective as soon as an entity starts using a version 4 SAQ. Now, in contrast, new requirements, and again, the clues in the name here are brand new requirements, not only for PCI DSS version 4, but also the SAQ. All right, so when these are initially out, they're going to be best practice, but adopting them can significantly help merchants protect their business. Now, remember, and we're probably hammering this home, those new requirements, they've got an effective date of the 31st of March, 2025. So the sooner you start working on them, the better.
So, John, thinking about that, could you, for me and for the audience here, just explaining a little bit more depth why we've made these changes to those requirements?
Okay, yeah. So, just here, just on the screen, we've got some of those existing and new requirements that have been added for SAQA. And you can hopefully see there's an increased focus on protecting those e-commerce websites. And these are a direct result of the threats against those e-commerce merchants. So you'll probably notice, and I've got it here, so some of the big changes are the inclusion of those external vulnerability scans, along with the identification and management of vulnerabilities. So why those new requirements? Well, let's just have a quick look as an e-commerce website as an example. So now put yourselves in, we've all done it, shopping online. So imagine you're that customer, you go through, you put the item into your basket, and you go, oh, I'm happy to buy that. You click on the buy now option, and you're presented with that payment page to enter your card details. So on the merchant side, there are two main options that they go for. So they either redirect to that kind of third-party payment page, or, and this is really to maintain that whole customer experience, they're embedding that payment, that payment page processor in an iframe on that website. Now, the protections that these are going to offer might not be immediately transparent, certainly for a merchant who's using an iframe. If you think from their position, what they've done is they've outsourced this to that PCI, compliant third-party service provider. Yeah, happy days. And they think, I can't control any element of that iframe. Everything's good. However, if you think about those SAQA merchants, yeah, they can still control the whole web page that iframe is being rendered. So just to give you an idea, there was been some other presentations on this. There's loads of scripts that are actually on those web pages. So we've got scripts that do tracking. There might be additional functionality such as chatbots, login or guest checkouts, and importantly, there's going to be a script that's going to be loading in that payment page iframe. So you look at it and you think, oh, okay, but what happens if one of those scripts is compromised? So malware could potentially copy that information that's being entered into that iframe, or maybe even redirect to a malicious site. So one thing just to stress here, that it potentially might not be the provider of that script, but it could also be, somebody, you've got dependencies that those scripts are being built on, so it could be a third or fourth party dependency. So this is why we've got these additional controls in here to protect those kind of payment page scripts. They're being managed, and there are the controls to detect that unexpected activity.
So we're aware then, following on this theme, that sometimes service providers, I'm going to choose my words carefully, they can perhaps be a little creative with the eligibility criteria in the SAQs. Can you tell us what options there are in version 4 of the PCI DSS around this, please?
Okay, so to take a quote from the 1980s film Highlander, and for those who haven't seen the film, and Tracy hadn't, so it completely fell flat, I'm not going to try and do an impersonation of Sean Connery trying to do a Spanish accent.
I think you should, actually.
I'm certainly not. But there can be only one. So, and to reinforce that point, well, actually, just stress, there can be only one, and that is SAQD for service providers. But to reinforce that point, if you look, and hopefully many of you have been looking through all of those SAQs, at the start of them, there's big, bold text that says, apart from the SAQDs, that this SAQ is not applicable to service providers. So service providers, they are valuable targets. If you compromise one service provider, if you do the maths, it could be, hundreds, thousands, or even potentially tens of thousands of merchants who could be directly affected. So SAQD has got all of the requirements that are in the standard, but for service providers, there are additional requirements as well. So again, have a look, and referring back to another document here, that summary of changes document for version 4, because you can see all of those new requirements, and nothing's going to come as a shock. But I touched on right at the start that additional reporting element for that SAQD for service providers. So there are new sections in that. So there's a section at the start where a service provider will be putting in their network diagram, information about their data storage details, and their vulnerability scans. And what we've also got in there, we've also got a field at the end of each requirement. And this is where the service provider is going to enter in the results of the testing activities that they've performed. Now, the idea behind this, because of the obviously importance of those service providers, is to provide an increased level of assurance that security controls have been consistently applied within that service provider environment. Now, eligibility, I keep coming back to this, but it's really critical for selecting the right type. And I'm just going to explain a little bit more why. So when we go through the development of an SAQ, requirements are selected from PCI DSS for a particular use case, and only the applicable requirements are being included in that SAQ. So it sounds pretty simple and a little bit of an innocuous statement, but if a merchant or service provider, and we touched on it earlier, potentially fudge that eligibility criteria, there are controls in PCI DSS that should be being adopted that aren't being adopted, and that's introducing risk to everyone in that payment channel. So when we're looking at these version 4 SAQs, we've gone through the eligibility criteria to make sure they still meet the needs of the payment industry, and we've also looked at addressing current and emerging threats. Now, some people have already been asking us on the stand, so we're aware of this, but SAQs are not standing still. So we're looking at developing new SAQs for PCI SSC validated solutions. So for example, some of you may be aware we've got standards for payment channels that are using mobile devices. And we hope to have those SAQs to support those channels really shortly.
So as you've heard then, lots of changes to the ROC, the AOC, the SAQs, as it relates to DSS version 4.0. And we know it's going to take time for the community to digest all of those changes. We expect some feedback, and we're hoping we get that feedback so we can evolve accordingly and continuously as well. So what we've tried to do, though, is to make reporting more streamlined, and to be streamlined to improve consistency between the compliance reporting. We're pretty confident that you'll let us know where we've got it right. And knowing quite a few out of there, I think I can say that I'm also confident you'll let us know where we need to improve things.
So ultimately, this is going to be down to you now. So when you're going to be looking at these reporting changes, couple of points. And, just to hammer these home, read that standard. I know it's quite big, but read the standard and take advantage of all that supporting material and guidance that's available. And another point I'm going to keep hammering home, we keep hammering this home, but those future dated requirements on the 31st of March, 2025. We don't want it coming as a shock to people because some of those are going to be, let's say, a little bit more potentially challenging for some organizations to implement. So ultimately, your preparation now is going to determine whether these reporting changes are going to be, a seismic change or just a mere ripple. Thank you very much.
Thank you.